Tanse. This is the customary greeting of the First Nations peoples who traditionally lived in the Edmonton area. The Alberta Teachers Association would like to acknowledge that we are presenting today from within the boundaries of Treaty 6, which was first signed at Fort Carleton, Saskatchewan in 1876. Treaty 6 is a vast area covering large portions of central Alberta and Saskatchewan and encompasses the reserve lands of 18 First Nations bands. Along with the Plains Cree First Nations, Treaty 6 also includes the traditional territories of the Nakota, Saulteaux, and Dene-Souline First Nations. My name is Sally Rudikoff. There's some pictures there just so you know who's on the other side of the screen as we don't have the video. I grew up in Lethbridge, Alberta, and I'm currently a teacher in St. Albert at the junior high level. I teach at Lorne Aikens, and it's a great place to be. Like Dan said, I'm an association instructor, and I'm happy to be here with you today to discuss the histories and cultures of First Nations people living in Alberta. I want to start with going over our workshop goals for today. This workshop is designed to help teachers and support staff become more aware of issues related to Aboriginal education. It does not necessarily provide detailed, in-depth information, but what I'm hoping is that this workshop will stimulate the desire for you to learn more about history, culture, worldviews, and pedagogy, and to start to consider ways to increase the effectiveness in addressing Aboriginal students' needs and helping non-Aboriginal students understand their diverse perspectives. So with that, there's two goals that we're going to get through today, and that's the first one there that you have on your screen, to learn the foundational information, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. As well, that second bullet there, to consider the implications for teaching and learning. That third bullet is what I'm hoping we'll get at next day, is to look at appropriate ways of communication with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students, parents, and communities, as well as focusing on little changes you can make in your classroom and ideas and tips for you to incorporate the history and culture of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students and people in your classroom. So, where will teachers meet Aboriginal students? I've found that sharing my journey and learning about First Nations history in Canada has opened up the door to have those conversations with many of my students. I didn't really hear about residential schools until I was 22 years old. I had heard faintly about residential schools, but I really didn't know what they were or understand the implications. At the time, I was at university and attended a Diversity Institute presentation at the U of A. And it really bothered me that this was a huge part of Canadian history that I was not told about. Since that time, and I think because of that, I've made a pointed effort of attending a lot of professional development to further my understanding and to ensure that I teach my students the truth about Canadian history. I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to listen to elders of 2 First Nations communities and many other speakers to help further my understanding of the history of First Nations people in Canada. This information has helped me ensure my students know the truth and are becoming advocates on their own. It's also opened up the door for those conversations. My students feel comfortable coming to me and telling me whether or not they identify as First Nations or Métis, and it's really added to my classroom culture and environment. And there are many places where teachers will meet Aboriginal students, and some students may not identify themselves as Aboriginal, and they might feel very comfortable to do that. But providing them those opportunities in that safe space, I think, is very important. This first activity is about the names of people, and our names are one really important aspect of who we are, and our names have a lot to do with our identity. So thinking back on yourself and how important your name is to you and your family. And a name can tell us a lot about the relationships around us. So this is a really great activity that you can use in your classroom, even if your students have known each other for a long time. We do this activity with adults, and I've used it with my students, and they've really enjoyed learning about each other. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be creating a name web that shows your different names that you go by and the relationship. So if you look on my example here, my name is Sally, which is in the middle. I go by Auntie Sally because I'm an aunt, and I go by Sal Pal because I'm a sister. I go by Rudy because I'm a coach. And so those are just examples, and I know some students struggled, well, I only have one name, but showing them that they go by many different names, whether it's their friends, if they're an athlete, they might get called something, whether they're playing a sport. So I'd like for you to take a few minutes to create your own name web. And when you're done, I would ask you to share one of your names in the chat window and just give a short explanation of that relationship. So in the chat window, I would put Auntie Sally and that I'm an aunt. I just wanted to share with you a few ways that you can focus on names in the classroom. Like I said, this is a really great activity that my students shared, and what I did is I got them to get up out of their desks and walk around and share one name that they felt comfortable sharing with 5 other people in the classroom. So it was a great way at the beginning of the year for students to learn more about their classmates. But other activities, especially for older students in Div 3-4, so grades 7 to 9, and probably even late elementary, you could engage students in a discussion of team names that identify Aboriginal words or names with team mascots. For example, discussing Edmonton Eskimos, and ask them to put themselves in the other's shoes and think about how they would feel if the Edmonton football team was named something else. And so just having those discussions with students. Other activities include researching the genealogy of names in your family and determine which names recur and why. That might be a great way to engage parents as well in your classroom, is to have that information shared as a class. Discussing what the meaning is behind family names and what people call themselves. So Canada's Constitution Act from 1982 defines Aboriginal people as those who are Indian or First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. Aboriginal peoples reflect diverse histories, interests, and perspectives. Their languages, ethnicities, and cultures vary widely, as do their beliefs, customs, and traditions. What collectively defines Aboriginal people is their shared ancestry. They are descendants of the original peoples of North America. There are many terms, and I'm going to point you to page 11 if you've got your participant guide handy. If not, that's okay. But there are many terms that are used, and when we are referring to a person, we want to make sure that we are using the most respectful and appropriate term. And so making sure that we understand the definitions, and when we're not sure what term to use, the best thing to do is to just ask. When I was at that Diversity Institute at the University of Alberta, Dr. Duane was presenting, and as a student and in my naivete wanted to know what was the one term to use when referring to Aboriginal people. And at the time I really struggled and I guess didn't understand why he couldn't give me a definitive answer. Looking back, I now understand that there is not one term. And I feel so stupid thinking back to that because at the time I was so worked up about it, and now I understand there is not one term to refer to groups of people. And so it's really important that we are respectful, that we understand the different terminology, so that when we are speaking to people, we are being respectful. And so on page 11, there is different terms and definitions there. One activity that is done in a workshop and that you could do with your students is to have the definitions and terms on different cards and have them try and match those terms so that they can get to know the different terms and make sure that they are using them respectfully and appropriately. This is found on the page 12 of your participant guide. This is by Liz Poitras, and this is called Who is an Indian? I would like to give you a few minutes to read through it. Dan put it up here on the slide in case you didn't have your participant. No more reading. So after reading this excerpt, as a classroom activity, you could generate a discussion regarding the importance of naming and categorizing groups of people. Also, depending on your class, you could discuss names and their importance in different cultures of students in your classroom. For older students, you could consider the implications and complexities of life for Aboriginal people. You could speculate on the Canadian system of categorizing Aboriginal people and consider the impact of the system on individuals. The design that we are using. So we select the tree to represent the conceptual model for this workshop. It's a natural living organism and it's connected to both the earth and the sky. It's grounded by its roots, supported by its trunk, protected by its bark, and fed through its leaves. So part of that meaning is that students should have a choice regarding their participation in classroom activities. It's important for teachers to know that there's a boundary separating those things that can be taught in the classroom and those that must be taught by the community. The ground is there to represent that boundary. So the roots are hidden from view to represent those teachings that are sacred to the community. Teachings such as the medicine bag, pipe ceremony, chicken dance, sweat lodge, and sun dances can only be taught by respected elders according to local protocols. The main branches of the tree represent the 4 important aspects of Aboriginal life: culture, history, worldviews, and contemporary issues. So this workshop will focus mainly on the 4 branches. And it's critical that teachers find out about local protocols regarding teachings, rituals, and ceremonies to make sure that we are being respectful. So that is the slide design for us, and that is our conceptual model for this workshop. So my next question for you, and I'm hoping you can use your stamp tool here to select the multiple choice question. The province of Alberta is covered by blank numbered treaties. So how many numbered treaties cover what is the province of Alberta? And then a bonus question for those of you who are aware is, can you name the numbered treaties in Alberta? Thank you for your responses. And thank you for those of you who did not resort to a Google search. The correct answer is 3, and those of you that wrote in Treaty 6, 7, and 8, you are correct. We are going to move through with a bit of history here in this next section. So European colonizers often signed treaties with indigenous peoples to legitimize their sovereignty and gain political and economic control over places and people. In many cases, the treaties were very disadvantageous to the native people, who often did not understand the implications of what they were signing. In Canada, all First Nations treaties were signed with the British Crown. Thus, the federal government has the primary responsibility under the Constitution of Canada to address the needs of Canada's Aboriginal people. However, provincial governments also have responsibilities with respect to Aboriginal people. In 1870, the Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land and the Northwest Territory, which included present-day Alberta and Saskatchewan, to the Dominion of Canada. The First Nations peoples of these lands had been devastated by smallpox. The buffalo were fast disappearing, and the fur trade had taken away a lot of the region's fur-bearing animals, making the First Nations' way of life impossible to sustain. The people had become paupers on their own land. The province of Alberta is covered by numbered treaties, which are legal documents that confer rights and specify obligations on both parties. No two treaties are identical. Treaties 6, 7, and 8, which are described in greater detail in that Education is Our Buffalo, cover most of Alberta and discuss rights such as entitlement to reserve lands, hunting, fishing, and trapping. To First Nations peoples, treaties are extremely meaningful and are seen as sacred agreements sworn to by the signing parties and sealed by pipe ceremonies. Their ceremonies involve the offering of tobacco, plant traditionally honored and respected among the people as a gift from the Creator to be used with respect and honored for its sacred properties. So in Education is Our Buffalo, there is a section with further information on the First Nations treaties. Pages 13 and 14 have more in-depth information, but with our time today, I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so please feel free to use Education is Our Buffalo as a resource for further information. There are also Métis settlements in Alberta, if you are not aware. And so there are 8 Métis settlements. Dan just put in the comment box that he will send out a PDF of Education is Our Buffalo for you to have a look at. As well, the next activity is a video for you to watch. So the URL is there on the page. What I have here is just another graffiti wall. What initial thoughts came to mind as you watched that video, and were you aware of the issues? So feel free to write on the wall and add your ideas. You can also just write your answers in the chat window if you'd like. As a Social Studies 7 teacher, I have the opportunity to discuss First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues in the classroom, and I've been able to share with my students the truth, and it's hard to talk about. There's a great resource for younger students, 12 and up, so not too young, called No Time to Say Goodbye, and it's look at residential schools from a student perspective. And so rather than a teacher-directed approach, this little novel was able to be used in my classroom as a resource where students were hearing, and it is fiction, but it's based on a true story. And so my students were able to hear from another child what residential schools were like. And so it was a great opportunity for my students to hear the truth, and those are tough conversations to have because students have a lot of questions as to why and how that was allowed to happen. At Aboriginal Day last year, I had the opportunity to listen to David Bouchard, and he came to our district to talk with our students. And one thing he said still sits with me and bothers me today. He said it was too late for my generation. We hadn't done enough to move forward with truth and reconciliation. But he had hope in the students that they were going to be the generation that was going to make a difference. So while it might be too late for my generation, I hope to make a difference for my students. And I know that many teachers in Alberta are on the same path, and they are trying to educate themselves and educate their students as in terms of the history and the lasting impact. And so that for me, and that video brings up those feelings and just encourages me to keep teaching the truth and to share with students. And those statistics are hard to see, and I'm going to be showing with you some more statistics here. So I thank you for your comments, reading through them. And it's true, Ross, about people who don't know the issues. But I am hoping that as we teach the rest of the teachers in Alberta that don't know and the students that don't know, that we can make a difference there. So thank you to everyone for your comments. If everyone is ready to move forward to the next slide, we're going to be looking at some of these statistics. I'm not going to read at you. I'm going to allow you to read the statistics and just reflect on that context and how those numbers might affect your teaching and might affect your classroom. Two of Alberta's biggest cities show up on this list here in terms of urban population. So Edmonton is second and Calgary is sixth in terms of Aboriginal people living in cities. And so that has implications for us as teachers as well. I think this first statistic here on this slide is important for our Div 4 teachers and discussions of what is happening at your schools for those Aboriginal learners in trying to change their path away from dropping out. After looking at and listening to some of these statistics, my question for you is, what are the implications in your school context? So you can reflect on your own. There is one question on page 29 of your participant guide if you would like to refer to that page. So just what are the implications in your school context? If you'd like to share your answer, either in on this slide or in the chat window so that everyone can share. Maybe one thing would be great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. I think that changing attitudes is a big step to take. Thank you for whoever wrote that. And I think by education, and someone made a comment that there were no Aboriginal students at their school. However, teaching the history and teaching what can be done, I think is a really positive and powerful step. I just want to quickly go over next session, and I'm hoping you can all join me again next week to continue these conversations. I really appreciate all of your ideas and thoughts that you've shared with me. Next session, we're going to do a just quick recap of what we talked about today. This is where we're going to be getting into the implications for teachers in the classroom. There's a great section on tips for talking with Aboriginal parents and caregivers of Aboriginal students, and some tips for teachers. I'd like to leave you with one thing. Try to choose one thought or action that you can take back with you this week based on what you've heard today. I call it my leaf before leaving. What is one action or thought you can take back to your school to keep the conversation going and to continue with education? So you can write that down. I like to write it down and keep it somewhere where I'm going to see it. If you want to write it in the chat window here for us to see, what's one takeaway that you are going to bring back with you at your school this week. But I do want to thank you so much for being here today, and I hope that you can join me again next week to continue the conversation. So thank you very much.